Hello, Assalamu alaikum, good afternoon, and kia ora, everyone. This is Hamza Ajmal from New Zealand studios with our today's program of Talking Points. Today, our host is Mr. Tariq Ashraf, who is a licensed immigration advisor based in Hamilton, New Zealand, and we are going to ask some contemporary and relevant questions about immigration New Zealand and the related issues that people are facing. So, we go to our guest, Mr. Tariq. Hello, Assalamu alaikum, Tariq. How are you doing?
Wa alaikum assalam, Hamza. Thank you for having me on your show.
So let's start with a brief introduction of yourselves, and instead of me introducing you, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thank you. I am a New Zealand licensed immigration advisor and a representative or agent for a number of New Zealand education institutions, including universities and institutes of technology. I have been working in this field for approximately 8 years, since 2014, to primarily focus on recruiting students from Pakistan to come to New Zealand.
Oh, thanks. But we'll also ask you some questions, not just related to educational immigration on visa sites, but also the other visa categories and issues. So, and as you know, that recently there has been a huge disruption in this space of immigration and visas, and most of the visas have been closed or stopped for a wee while, for not a wee while, for over 2 years in New Zealand. So, what is happening in this space? Do you can you start with what has happened and what is going to happen in near future and in extended future?
For sure. So, as you'll be aware, the border in New Zealand has been closed for almost 2 years, since March 2020, when for most visa categories, temporary visa categories, the border was closed and only New Zealand citizens or residents had the right of return. What that meant that a number of people who had lived in New Zealand up to that point on a temporary visa, whether it be a student visa or a work visa, for example, if they happened to be outside New Zealand at the time that the border closed, they were stuck offshore. And that has been a cause of quite a lot of pain and disruption for a number of people. In addition, people have been affected if they had visa applications in process at that time, but were offshore, and all visa processing stopped very suddenly. And as you know, that situation has continued since then. Over time, the New Zealand government has reduced those restrictions and allowed categories of people to enter New Zealand, and even now there are exemptions in place. For example, those who are married to a New Zealand citizen or resident, and both partners are offshore, they're able to come to New Zealand together, for example. Also, critical workers in different industries have been able to enter New Zealand, for example, health workers. It's meant that there's, as I say, been a lot of disruption and a lot of delays caused to people, and their plans have been disrupted. Those things that they thought they had, they haven't been able to avail. For example, so in the case of a post-study work visa holder who happened to go offshore to visit family, and that post-study work visa is obviously for a finite period of time, and then must be converted into another visa to enable that person to stay in New Zealand, another work visa, for example. People who happen to travel offshore, they haven't been able to return, and there is no certainty as of now in terms of whether their visas will be extended for any length of time in order to compensate for the time that has been lost. The government has announced a 5-step plan to reopening New Zealand. That plan was announced a few weeks ago. So I can give you, and it's called Reconnecting New Zealand, and I can take you through very briefly the 5 steps of that plan, which go through from next week, in fact, a week from today, up until October this year, October 2022. So under step 1, and step 1 begins from 11:59 p.m. Next Sunday, the 27th of February, and the border will reopen to fully vaccinated New Zealanders and other eligible travellers under current border settings, for example, people with border exceptions, from Australia. Under step 2, which will start on at 11:59 p.m. on Sunday the 13th of March, the border will reopen to fully vaccinated New Zealanders and other eligible travellers under the current border settings from the rest of the world. It will also open to skilled workers who are earning at least 1.5 times the median wage, and working holiday schemes will also open for applications. Those will roll out over time, and the exact order is yet to be determined. Under step 3, which will begin at 11:59 p.m. on Tuesday, the 12th of April, the border will open to existing offshore student and work visa holders who can still meet the relevant visa requirements. So I'll just expand on that a little. So if you have a valid current student visa or work visa, so it hasn't expired yet, and you happen to be offshore, and you can meet the requirements of your visa. In other words, if there were any requirements related to enrolment and study, if there are any requirements related to holding a job, for example, if you're still able to meet those visa requirements and you're offshore, then you're able to re-enter New Zealand from the 12th of April. Students or workers who are in New Zealand already and they hold valid, i.e. haven't expired, multiple entry visas can depart New Zealand and return without needing a border exception. Now, I would say for those people who have a valid student or work visa and wish to travel out of New Zealand earlier, they may do so. That's the date after which they will be able to return without needing to meet the border exception requirements, etc. Thirdly, border class exception applications will open for up to 5,000 international students who are intending to study from July onwards. Now, what the government has done over the past 12 months, well, longer than that, approximately 18 months, has had several batches or phases in which they have allowed for a limited number of students offshore to apply for a visa to come to New Zealand. In the first phase, they allowed for 250 students. In the second phase, they allowed for 1,000, and there was also a third phase. So this one is for up to 5,000 international students who are intending to stay from July onwards. It could be that they're already studying online, and this will allow them to continue their studies in New Zealand from July onwards. The government is still working through the process, the Ministry of Education with Education New Zealand and Immigration New Zealand and the providers in terms of who is going to be eligible under that. And they will be liaising with the institutions. There will be a certain number of places given to each institution, and each institution will then work with their student cohort to identify those who will be invited to apply. It's still not clear whether that is going to include partners of those students or dependents, that is children of those students, because of course for certain visa categories, including PhD, partners and dependents are eligible for a visa also, whether it be a work visa, a visit visa, or a student visa. And finally, also from the 12th of April, there will further class exceptions for some critical workforces will also be considered. Moving on to step 4, which starts in July 2020, and there's no specific time frame that has yet been decided for this, but it is intended that by July 2022, the border will open to anyone from Australia and also will open for visa waiver travel. Now, that means if you're a citizen of a country listed as a visa waiver country, that is, you don't need a visa to apply for a visa to come to New Zealand, you can be issued a visa on arrival, then the border will open for citizens of those countries. Furthermore, visitor visa holders who are in New Zealand will be able to depart and return, just as the student and work visa holders will have been able to. And also from July, the accredited employer work visa will open, which will mean that skilled and health worker border exceptions will be able to be phased out. The fifth and final step, which is intended to begin in October or by October, and again, there's no specific timing for this yet, the border will fully reopen to travellers, and visa categories such as student and visitor visas will open for processing. So that's an important point, that the border will not necessarily be open, it won't be open for applications before October, and so you won't necessarily be able to arrive in October, but the intention is that the processing will start in October. That's according to the information that has been announced to date, and of course it is subject to change. What can be inferred from that perhaps is that given that timing, October, and given the length of time it typically takes for a visa application to be processed under normal circumstances, and taking into account the fact that the border has been closed for almost, or by that stage will have been closed for 2.5 years, that there is the potential for quite a lot of pent-up demand, and as a result there would be quite a large number of visa applications. So perhaps Immigration New Zealand is thinking that it may take up to 6 months to process some of those applications, because as you know, the semester in New Zealand, shall we say the autumn semester, begins in March. So perhaps they're allowing themselves a good 6 months to process the bulk of those applications and to allow students and visitors enough time to be able to enter New Zealand. As I say, this is what has been announced so far, and is subject to COVID playing out over the next few months. And it's acknowledged that New Zealand has been one of the later countries to reopen. Countries like Canada and Australia have been more open and for longer than New Zealand has. And hopefully New Zealand will be able to catch up soon.
Thanks for the overview. So what I understand from what you said is that these phases that are starting from next week until July are not for new visas. They are for those who have existing visas and the visas that have not expired. And anyone who leaves the country and has those visas, like working visa or student visa, can come back. The new,
That's correct. So
yeah,
it hasn't opened for processing by April,
yeah,
and except for particular exceptions.
yeah.
For example, that border class exception for 5,000 international students.
So just one little clarification on the student visas and students is that you mentioned there are 5,000 coming by July, and these 5,000 are those that are existing students. There won't be any new students in that cohort of 5,000.
That's difficult to say at this stage. I don't have any information about that either way. I have attended a briefing by Immigration New Zealand, and to find out what the situation might be. What we have been told is that cohort 4 does include returning students. So it does include those who perhaps were studying previously but left and their visa expired, and perhaps they have been continuing their studies offshore. They can apply for a new visa and return. Whether this will allow for new students, my personal opinion, and it's only a personal view, is that this is likely to include those students who have enrolled for the first time to study while they are offshore and they have been studying for some time. So they will be a first-time visa holder, but their study has been ongoing for some time, is my presumption.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for
It
this.
may be that there are certain students and certain qualifications which only begin in July, and they may well be first-time students and first-time visa holders, and we'll just have to wait and see whether that's the case.
Thanks for this clarification. So, going on to some other questions that I had for you. Do you think that when the new student visas and other visa categories open, there would be any change in the requirements? For example, maintaining certain amount of funds that you have to show before you apply, or fee, or any other thing that you think might change?
Yes. For approximately the past 18 months, Immigration New Zealand has been foreshadowing that they are doing work to update the settings for some visas. And certainly for student visas, that is the case. And specifically, they have mentioned that the funds requirement for maintenance while the student is in New Zealand, which currently sits at $1,250 per month, and $15,000 per year, depending on the length of time or the length of the program of study. It has been mentioned that hasn't been increased for quite some time, and that is not keeping pace with the cost of living. And may be placing students in hardship when they arrive in New Zealand because it's no longer realistic. And so that is one setting that has specifically been mentioned, and in fact has been increased for the border exceptions for the phases that have been in place already, and has gone up from 15,000 to 20,000. So it's expected that figure will remain, if not increase even further, at around that $20,000 New Zealand dollars per year. In terms of other changes that may be expected, they haven't been foreshadowed specifically, but Immigration New Zealand has been saying for some time that there are changes that they are anticipating will be made.
Thanks. So now that New Zealand is opening its borders in phases, and I also heard that they are also updating their visa application processing. So would those new visas would be paper-based or online?
So Immigration New Zealand has been on a pathway for some time now to move from a paper-based system to an online system. Predominantly, even today, visa processing is online. The process of applying and then the back-end processing happens in an online platform. It is still possible to make paper-based applications, but Immigration New Zealand is and it's expected that will continue. As to whether there will be a hard date for that in conjunction with the border reopening, that isn't something that has been. The two things haven't been linked, but it can be expected that will continue. For example, the offshore processing component of most visas has now ended, where Immigration New Zealand had processing offshore, for example, in the Pacific or in Asia, whether that be in China or in India, those offshore posts have closed, and all processing is now happening onshore. There are, of course, still visa application centres offshore, including in Karachi in Pakistan. And so people can provide, either submit their applications or send their passports when they're requested, or if there's any other information that has been requested by Immigration New Zealand, they can still submit it at those visa application centres. But of course, all they are going to do is convert those into a digital format and share those with Immigration New Zealand. They're not going to be posting them to New Zealand. So it's already substantially online, and that's just going to continue.
Right. Thanks for this. At this point, we'll just take a short break and we'll be right back. Thank you. So we are back from the break.
Shorter than expected.
Shorter than expected, yes. So going on to another important hot topic that a lot of migrants are facing, hot issue migrants are facing these days, is family reunification. What I want to understand and from you is that when is that going to happen? Because a lot of migrants are onshore here working or in any other way, and then their partners and families are offshore. When would they be able to fly in?
Yeah. So though if they were visa holders in their own right, and they happen to be offshore, for example, they were partners of a New Zealand citizen or a New Zealand resident, or even the partner of a temporary visa holder, then they will be able to return according to the timetable. And in fact, they have been able to return previously while the border has been closed. It's under the border exception or exemption process. And so there is a request for approval for travel.
I think the link with the guest has just dropped. We'll
Sorry about that. We may have been disconnected.
That's all right.
So those partners of New Zealand citizens or residents have been able to enter New Zealand, but the condition has been that they must do so with that New Zealand partner. So that has required the New Zealand partner to go offshore and apply for that exemption and for those to travel together. Now that hasn't been problematic in the cases of people who have been existing visa holders. It may be a more challenging process for those who at the start of their relationship. And as I mentioned at the beginning, those who have been most impacted have been those who perhaps had an application in process at the time the border closed, and it has been most challenging for them. So there's no specific timetable for those visa holders in terms of those partnership categories. They seem to be considered under the general categories of visit, for example. And as has been indicated, because those who are applying for a visa for the first time, they're not existing visa holders, then they will be able to apply from October. What people have been able to do, and principal applicants who are New Zealand citizens or residents have been able to, as I say, leave New Zealand and apply for an exemption for those for them to return to New Zealand with their offshore partner. And that has depended quite a lot on the on the conditions in the country in which that partner is located, as to whether that country's border is open and for the New Zealander to be able to travel there. So there have definitely been a lot of disruptions in that case. There are other family categories as well, and I'm not sure if you're referring to those, but for those such as the parent resident visa or the parent retirement resident visa, those are definitely suspended as a result of COVID-19, but those, of course, are resident visas rather than temporary visas, and there's no indication yet, or no timetable has been provided yet as to when those may reopen.
Right. So going on, just building on this family reunification thing, people who come from the countries like Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and the other countries that have a similar background, there is a lot of difficulty for the applicants to show their relationship with their spouses who are offshore, or in especially the living together and other, because of the cultures, it's not possible or it's not commonly done. So, what sort of evidence is required to convince immigration in New Zealand that the relationship is legitimate?
Yeah. So there's a couple of elements there. Now, first thing I will say is that even though I'm legally entitled to provide immigration advice, this discussion we're having is not immigration advice, and so I'm providing as much as possible information that's already available, rather than providing advice that's applicable to a particular application. Obviously,
Mhm.
I don't know what someone's situation is, and therefore exactly what's required for their potential application. But I do appreciate what you're saying, and what the approach that is applied in New Zealand for partnership visas is the critical element is something called living together in a genuine and stable relationship. So that is, there's four elements there. You have to be living together. You have to be in a relationship of some sort, whether it's a marriage or something else. And that has to be genuine and stable, meaning it's likely to endure, and genuine meaning that you're committing to this relationship for the long term and on an exclusive basis. There are many examples that Immigration New Zealand provides in its operational manual for how you can provide evidence for each of those four elements. For example, you can prove the existence of a relationship through your marriage certificate, other documentation. Can you show that you've made plans for the future together? Can you show that how your household activities are shared? What's the nature of your financial arrangements? How do you present to the public or to the outside as a couple? What sort of public recognition is there of your relationship? So those are all things that Immigration New Zealand will take into account. There is also a requirement around the length of the relationship, but it is possible to inform Immigration New Zealand about the length of time that the two partners have spent apart and what the reasons may be for that, because it is acknowledged that there may well be genuine reasons, and it's not necessary for a couple to have lived together for 12 months, for instance. So in the case of people from South Asia, where culturally arranged marriages perhaps are more common, and the time spent living together doesn't begin until after that relationship is formalized in the form of a marriage. What couples are able to do is demonstrate the progression or history of their relationship, and from how they were introduced, by whom and when, right through to the marriage, and then beyond. It is acknowledged that it is challenging to find evidence, for example, of the sort that is listed in the examples provided by Immigration New Zealand, such as utilities bills in the name of the couple, or correspondence addressed to both of them together, or a joint bank account, for example. Some of these things are not common in some South Asian contexts, and so that does make things a bit more challenging. But the key principle is that the relationship, they're looking for evidence that the relationship is genuine, essentially. That this isn't a relationship that has been entered into simply for the purpose of obtaining a visa, but rather this is a relationship that the two parties are entering into for a long-term and exclusive basis. And what evidence are they able to procure in order to demonstrate that? When the border was open, what the approach was that was being taken, because there is a partnership-based temporary visa application under normal circumstances, and the New Zealand partner, the citizen or resident, provides support for the application, and there are requirements, etc., related to that. And what was happening was, because the requirement wasn't able to be demonstrated at an early stage of the relationship, what the approach that was being taken was for the offshore partner to apply for a general visitor visa for a relatively short period, in order for them to be able to travel to New Zealand and to live together with their New Zealand-based partner, and to be able to provide gather that evidence while they're in New Zealand. And then once they have sufficient evidence, to then apply for a further temporary visa on the basis of their partnership. So that was a workaround that was possible and potentially will be available again when the border reopens. But in the meantime, I would say, without going into specifics, anyone's welcome to contact me afterwards, and we can talk about their specific situation. But I would say that let's try and find what evidence you do have that relates to the nature of your relationship, and it would be good for someone who's in that situation, looking to enter into a relationship, a marriage offshore, to speak to a licensed immigration advisor early in the process, so that they can get advice on what sorts of evidence they should be collecting along the way, because quite often people don't think about it. And they don't collect that physical evidence, and for example, records of communication, and when the time comes, they don't have it. So that's what I would say. Whether you're in New Zealand or in Australia, or watching from anywhere around the world, if there happen to be New Zealand licensed immigration advisors in your country, please get in contact with them. If not, then speak to one of the licensed immigration advisors in New Zealand. Everyone's details are on the Immigration Advisors Authority website, and get in contact early in the case.
Thanks for this elaboration and detailed answer. I just want you to elaborate a little bit more on this aspect of licensed immigration advice, and why is it important to have advice from the licensed people?
Excellent. No, that's a very good question. So at the heart of the system is about protecting the interests of migrants. We know that migration is a journey that people undertake for social or cultural or economic reasons, and it can be life-changing. And it's usually a major decision in the context of their life, whether that's related to their financial situation, or their education, and even separation from their loved ones. They don't necessarily, or they're not necessarily familiar with the process. It may be the first time they're being involved in a process like this, and so they can be quite vulnerable. What was the situation in New Zealand, certainly up to approximately 2007 that people were providing advice to immigrants, and they don't have any sort of qualification, and essentially they were what's the word? They were exploiting vulnerable migrants or potential migrants. So the government introduced legislation to introduce a regulatory regime for immigration advisors. The key aspect of which is that anyone who wants to provide immigration advice for New Zealand must have a license, and that licensing regime is overseen by the Immigration Advisors Authority. And what that sets out is there's a detailed code of conduct that all advisors must abide by. There's a relatively strict entry regime that includes an educational qualification, which is the New Zealand diploma a graduate diploma, I beg your pardon, in New Zealand immigration advice, which is a level 7 qualification, and they must be a fit and proper person. They must meet their professional responsibilities and undertake a certain amount of professional development each year, because they need to be competent, they need to be professional, and that's how they must conduct themselves with their clients or potential clients. So anyone who wants to provide that advice, certainly who's in New Zealand, must be licensed. There are certain categories of people who are exempt. For example, those who are a lawyer, which means they're enrolled as a barrister and solicitor in New Zealand, or they're a member of parliament, and there are certain other categories where there are exemptions. Offshore, that is outside New Zealand, there is an exemption for those who are only providing advice on student visas or for education. So that is for education agents, basically. But if an education agent is purporting to provide advice on visitor visas, work visas, or residence visas, then they need to be licensed in order to do that.
Right. Thanks. I have a question online about the opportunities for permanent residents or residents that are available for someone, say, is engineer and has a long experience of 10 to 15 years. What opportunities do they have?
Sure. So the first thing I would say is that right now, unfortunately, for those who are offshore, basically the opportunities are zero, because the residence program and the skilled migrant category, which this is relevant to, is still suspended and not taking further expressions of interest. And there is no time frame as of today as to when that is going to reopen. What I would say is that in general terms, engineering disciplines on what is called the long-term skill shortage list. So they're one of the lists of scarce occupations, and as a result, there are and have been for quite some years opportunities for engineers in New Zealand, and of course with notwithstanding professional requirements for engineering in New Zealand and equivalency of qualifications, etc. Those sorts of things notwithstanding, there are certainly opportunities, and there are a number of engineers of Pakistani or Indian or even Bangladeshi origin and Sri Lankan origin who have offshore experience and have been able to migrate to New Zealand and successfully integrate into the New Zealand workforce. I would say it's worthwhile to have a look at the job opportunities in each engineering discipline to get a better idea. I wouldn't say that the opportunities are equal in every discipline all around New Zealand. There are differences by region where there are different skills requirements, so it might be that there is an opportunity for a particular discipline and outside the main centres, and that's something for people to be open to doing.
Thanks for this answer. At this point, I think we should wind up our program for today, and it's been very informative and for me and for, as well as for our audiences. So thanks for your time, and have a good night. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Bronwyn Halfpenny. I'm a state elected representative for the seat of Thomastown. I represent people that live in Lalor, Thomastown, Epping, Wollert and Reservoir. I've asked our local doctors to tell us what they think about the COVID disease and the vaccine. Every doctor has jumped at the chance without hesitation. They've volunteered their time because they care about you and me and our neighbourhood. Many of our doctors grew up here or have chosen to live here, and their parents are also here. They want all of us to be safe. They are the experts. Please listen to them. I have been vaccinated to protect myself, my community, those I love. I hope you do too.